Good morning, good morning. Glad to see you all here today on this warm summer day in St. Louis. So, we've been talking about the Genjo Koan, the writing of Dogen Zenji from the 13th century, and we've discussed some of the first passages from the Genjo Koan, and we're now up to a passage that is probably the most oft-quoted passage of Master Dogen. So it's a little intimidating to talk about. At least it's the most oft-quoted in Western Buddhism. And I think it is so often referred to because it encapsulates so succinctly Dogen's message to us, not only in the Genjo Koan, but in all of his writing. So we'll start with the text. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the body and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. So this is the translation of Kaz Tanahashi and Robert Aitken. So what is Dogen trying to tell us? Well, there are many interpretations of this, many perspectives. Dharmavidya Brazier, who spoke a couple weeks ago about the Genjo Koan, has a very interesting perspective on this passage and the others in this work. There was also a very detailed book by Shohaku Okamura about the Genjo Koan. And many others have written commentaries on this work and on this passage. And I think that Dogen would be pleased by people deriving different perspectives on the meaning of these words, because I think they are intended to have many facets and not just one simple meaning. But Shohaku Okamura reminds us in his commentary that the word to study in Japanese is narau. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it's spelled N-A-R-A-W in the Romanized version of Japanese. And he reminds us that study may perhaps more accurately be translated as learn, because the character has bird wings, a bird with wings on the top, and then below that, the character for self, as if the kind of learning is that of a young bird learning to fly. Not the intellectual kind of learning where we study books in order to try to refine our concepts, but the practical kind of learning where we learn by doing. So to study the self in this way So Sawaki Kodo, the teacher of Okamura's teacher, phrased this passage this way: it's the self selfing the self. To study the Buddha way, the self selfing the self. Becoming familiar with, becoming intimate with oneself. And what better way to become intimate with oneself than to sit still in silence, facing a wall, confronting mind, with no place to hide. So this is Zazen. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. Well, this seems odd. Usually when we study something, we study it in order to retain it, or to grasp it, or to remember it. But in this case, we gain intimacy with something in order to understand how flimsy and insubstantial it really is. To, in a sense, deconstruct the self. To see through the story of the self. One might say to become disenchanted with self. I remember when I was in college, I used to go to the coffee shop at the student union, and there for a while I was keeping a journal, and I had the impression at one point that I had just a series of just wonderful thoughts. So I started writing them down and keeping track of my wonderful thoughts. And it didn't take too long, maybe a month or two, until I realized that my wonderful thoughts were rather repetitive. And my wonderful thoughts, when I would look back on them, seemed kind of boring. I think it's an example of becoming disenchanted with the self. So if we're to forget the self and to see that the self is, as might be said, empty, then what's left? What do we do? What do we do with our lives? So Dogen goes on, and he says to forget the self is to become actualized by myriad things. One might say to become intimate with many things, with the other things out there, with the other, with the environment of our lives. To become engaged with that we encounter from day to day. To become actualized, to be put into action by our life. So it, in a way, reflects a previous passage in the Genjo Koan that we talked about in previous weeks, which I will try to bring up here. To carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion, but that myriad things come forth and experience themselves through you is awakening. So it's allowing the other, it's allowing myriad things, it's allowing the things in our lives to actualize us. And not to put the imprint of our self-concern on everything else. When actualized, your body and mind as well as the body and mind of others drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. Body and mind dropping away. So, what does this mean? Again, in Dogen's writing, this is sort of a code phrase for Zazen. Body and mind dropping away. When disenchanted with the self, the need to justify, protect, defend, the self drops away. Like the spiritual song, when I lay my burden down, body and mind dropping away. And then one can attend to the needs of one's life, to what one encounters, taking care of one's life. So, not long ago, Carol and I saw a lecture that Professor Clark Chilson gave. Professor Chilson is a scholar of religious studies at University of Pittsburgh, and he specialized in Japanese study, Japanese religions, and Japanese history. So he gave an interesting talk about a character you may not be familiar with, 10th century wandering monk called Kuya. That was his Buddhist name, Kuya. So Kuya would have been, I think the legend anyway of Kuya would have been well known to Dogen, because it's very much a part of Japanese culture. And he lived a couple centuries before Dogen. We know little about his parentage because he never talked about his family. He left home at an early age, was in a monastery for a period of time, but left the monastery and spent the rest of his life wandering about. Doing what? Well, one of the things he was noted for was Nembutsu practice, that is, reciting the name of the Buddha again and again. Namo Amitabhu, Namo Amitabhu. As a practice to keep the Buddha in mind. So, there are many stories about Kuya. In his wanderings here and there, he would do, I guess, what we would call good deeds. If he encountered a stream that didn't have a bridge over it, he would stop and work on building a bridge. If he encountered a steep slope in the path, he would work on building some stairs so that other travelers could have an easier time traversing the path. And even if he went for a long stretch on the road and there was no water available, he would dig a well. And apparently there are wells here and there in Japan that are attributed to Kuya. So there are many stories about Kuya, but this story caught my attention. And Professor Chilson recounted this story. I'll just read it. In this tale, we are told that Sengan was on his way home one day after giving a lecture at the court when he encounters Kuya. Sengan gets out of his carriage and asks him, "What should I do for my salvation in the next world?" To which Kuya replies, "What? You have it backwards, sir. Surely it is I who should be asking you such things. A lowly person like me, I've wandered around and I've learned nothing. I've no ideas at all." And Kuya then tries to leave. But Sengan grabs his sleeve and continues to question him with increasing desperation. Kuya finally says to him, "Discard yourself in whatever way you can," then pulls himself free and leaves Sengan there in the road. We are told that it was after this encounter with Kuya that Sengan decided to live a life of seclusion. So discard the self in whatever way you can. I think Kuya is saying something very similar to what Dogen is saying in this passage from the Genjo Koan. Forget the self, drop away body and mind. But through his life, Kuya also demonstrates becoming intimate with myriad things, seeing what needs to be done, taking care of what needs to be done, taking care of his life and the life of others to the extent that he can. So, discard yourself in whatever way you can. One might think, well, why didn't Kuya just say, recite the Nembutsu like me? Well, maybe Sengan wasn't like Kuya and had to find his own way of discarding the self. So in many religious traditions, there are alternative ways of discarding the self. And the way that Dogen advocated was what was taught by his teacher, Rujing, in China, Zazen practice. And the last little part of this no trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. To me, it might seem contradictory. I mean, if there's no trace, what is it that continues endlessly? And of course, Dogen was not afraid of paradox, and in the Zen tradition, paradox is used perhaps to a fault. But to me, this portion, this phrase, this sentence, is very much similar to another sentence we have looked at. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily notice they are Buddhas. There is no trace. However, they are actualized Buddhas who go on actualizing Buddhas, even though they may not be caught up in recognizing their Buddhahood, even though they may not be caught up in recognizing that they have abandoned the self. Their actions as a result have consequences that carry on endlessly. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So this is a statue of Kuya. Whose motto was discard the self, and whose actions revealed another part to that, which is make yourself useful. One might say, take care of your life. See what needs to be done. Do what you can. Sounds simple. So I think we'll stop there and discuss this further in small groups. I appreciate your listening today. Thank you so much.